So let's talk through the new Leagues of Votann release wave, all the expectation for the new models and how we got to this point, then go through each of the new kits, what we know about the miniatures, which ones people like the most, and all the details that we know about their rules. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd talk some Space Dwarfs, first with a brief recap of how the Leagues of Votann got to this point, and then focus in on the new kits. The Leagues of Votann appearing in modern 40k were certainly a surprise. They may be featured on a few wish lists for armies that people hoped Games Workshop might bring back at some stage, but most people weren't seriously expecting them to. They'd been removed quite so far in the past that they were ancient history for a lot of newer collectors, I think losing model support in 2nd edition 40k. Games Workshop quietly discontinuing their miniatures and removing rule support going on for them, to the point where they became a meme for miniatures being removed. People referring to miniatures and armies getting squatted as being removed from the game. Warhammer 40k was certainly a very different beast back then, and their range entirely consisted of classic metal models, with a few infantry and their war trike type things here. They had a little bit of representation in epic 40k, including a tiny miniature for a land train. They basically had little to no mention in lore for a really long time. There were some bits in passing that implied they might have been devoured by the Tyranids, but then it turned out that these squats reappeared on Necromunda. First up, they had the resin miniatures on the top right, seemingly proving that at least a couple of space dwarves had survived their race's extinction and still existed in the setting, and then were eventually followed up with their entire range, the Ironhead Squat Prospectors, perhaps trying to ape the old models a little bit more than the Leagues of Votann chose to, still more as a distant diverged offshoot of humanity rather than what the Votann had become. The Leagues of Votann turned up in the same year though. We had the first teasers of them around April Fool's Day, to which people weren't sure what they'd make of it, though Games Workshop rapidly came back to say that they were indeed serious, and it turned out their new range of space dwarves had diverged from the squats in the distant past, and now were basically a race of clones, guised over by their aging AI Votann ancestor course, which acted as a centre point to their civilization, driving their leagues ever forward in pursuit of resources and manufacturing kin, ironkin, and all the weapons that they need to venture forth into the stars, settle old grudges, and strip entire worlds of mineral wealth. Their weapons were basically diverged from Imperial-style technology, their own versions of bolters, autocannons, conversion beamers and more, and their warriors clad in fine void armour. Their first launch wave had at least a fair amount of kits, 4 character miniatures, 5 squads, a transport vehicle, and a big central land fortress. As it goes for a completely new faction, I don't think they did too badly. It's enough so you could field some genuinely different flavours of army and kin if you wanted to. Though still compared with the more established factions of Warhammer 40k, there's not quite as much variety as you might hope for. Certainly if you compare them to say Tyranids or Eldari or Tau or Orcs or something. Since that initial release, there were a few more things that came out for them. They had a couple of limited time discount box sets, a Christmas Battle Force one and a Boarding Patrol. For new miniatures, they did have a couple of updates as well. The Ironkin Steeljacks were quite a nice addition to the range, Scouty kin in big trench coats and filling the infiltrator niche for the army, and the Hearthkin themselves got an upgrade pack as well called the Hearthkin Salvagers. For game terms for 40k that didn't really change too much though, just adding in a heavy weapon and an extra power weapon. Beyond that, I think the only 2 releases that they had were a couple of limited edition ones, a limited Ironhead Champion and Carl. Not really doing anything too crazily different with the models there, but could be nice enough if you wanted a different sort of pose for one of them. People were wondering whether or not the Leagues of Votann would get a big release wave this edition. I thought it seemed pretty odds on. I think there was the general sense they'd release a bunch of stuff last time, but maybe not everything. But then on the other hand, we had things like the World Eaters, who admittedly were maybe more of an expansion of core Codex Chaos Marines, but people were really hoping for a second wave for them, and all they got was the Slaughterbound. Seems that the Leagues of Votann did a fair bit better though, getting 6 new kits rather than just 1 token character. Overall 7 new units due to the vehicle having 2 different variants, and they also get a new combat patrol as well. It does mean that the previous combat patrol will be going away, and there's no mention so far of any sort of launch Battle Force box set coming for them. I guess they could still surprise us with this one. We didn't officially know about the big War Dog box set for the Chaos Knights until the week of release, but I feel like if the new kits were coming in a big launch box style thing, they probably would have told us about that with the release. Generally they've tended to do that when it's happened, for things like say the Death Corps Krieg, the Emperor's Children and the Space Wolves. For the kits they've got 3 characters, Buri Aegnirssen, the Tyranid hunting special character, an Arkanyst Evaluator and a Memnyr Strategist, some Ironkin Steeljacks, some Mole Mortar Artillery in the Cthonian Earthshakers, and then a scout transport for the Ironkin, which can build the Kapricus carrier or the Defender gun variant. Obviously, we don't really know release dates at this point. It seems that the Black Templars and the Grey Knights are getting their Codex coming out now, and then in theory they have the Imperial Knights Codex to release at some stage, though it seems that that's had some sort of massive delay and we don't know what. Plus the Space Marine release weekend will take up one as well, and we don't know whether or not the Leagues of Votann will be this side or the other of that. By Games Workshop's normal previews though, I'd perhaps guess that they'll be coming out around about September time or maybe early October. It could potentially be sooner than that, but I think I'd be surprised if so. Usually they don't tend to show off things enormously far out. Worth mentioning that with the reveals, one thing that didn't materialise was a new Leagues of Votann jump pack unit. I feel like plenty of people were expecting to see a whole unit of this guy, the Leagues of Votann jump pack from the Hearthkin upgrade sprue, clearly showing that they have the technology and use it, and at some stage I absolutely expect that they will have a full unit of these guys. Seems barring any surprises, it's not coming with the 10th edition release for them. I still absolutely guess that the unit will turn up at some point or other, though probably in 11th edition or later. I guess technically they could be a kill team, but seems kind of unlikely given that they've already had two. Jumping in to look through the individual models though, first up we have the Arkanyst Evaluator. Apparently his lore is that he's a Leagues of Votann scientist. He tests weaponry for mass production, and it seems that the weapon in particular that this guy's testing is a transmatter inverter, some sort of weird exotic technology with a great big energy ball type thing fed by a power feed from a backpack. They said that it can rupture tissues at a cellular level, and apparently if dialed up to the maximum it can do atomic transformations. I'm not really too sure what that means. Maybe they turn it into antimatter or something and it blows up. The model itself, he's got a pretty enormous chunky and techy gun with a whole bunch of canisters coming off it and a great array of lenses to better record the destruction, no doubt. A power pack on his back with some lights, wires and dials and things, and the miniature has a head swap depending on whether or not you want him looking like a Leagues of Votann mad scientist, or a chunky helmet with some almost biker style goggles maybe. This one, like seemingly the vast majority of the other Leagues of Votann range, solves one of our rumour engines. In terms of reception to the model, people were maybe a little bit mid on this one. I feel like his unhelmeted head is maybe painted just a little bit curiously with those very glowing blue eyes. I don't know if they're reflecting the destruction it's causing on the foe, no doubt disintegrating before him maybe. I'd hope that perhaps his price might be a little bit cheaper than some characters out there, maybe around about the $35 or £21 or so, though knowing Games Workshop could certainly be more. Rules-wise, he's going to be a character choice that gets lone operative near infantry, so I guess ideally you'd probably want to be advancing him in tandem with something else. I can't imagine he's going to be all that durable by himself, possibly something like a 4-wound character. It is interesting that he's very likely to be all about the damage though. The transmatter inverter has apparently got 3 different fire modes, so probably going to have a good range of damage that will make him effective against any targets that he chooses to point the gun at. Hopefully something like anti-tank, anti-elites and anti-horde. Just from the appearance of it, I can't help but think it's probably going to be a short-ranged weapon. Most Leagues of Votann weapons tend to be. I'd certainly be curious as to what his special rule was, as they didn't really say. Feels like it's going to be very dependent on his points cost and just how devastating the damage output is. Before we move on to the other Votann models, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Baron of Dice. They're a high quality dice maker based in the USA. They made some fancy dice for the channel and asked to sponsor some videos. Their thing is to basically have a vast amount of different dice that could be applicable to all sorts of wargaming factions out there. There's plenty that could be appropriate enough for dwarves or space dwarves. They have some nice Hearthfire or Molten Lava ones, though they've got a few other designs as well. There's plenty of other options though, things for Golden Guardians, Knightly Helms, all manner of different ones for the various flavours of chaos out there. The same for certain chapters. Most of the dice you can choose between the rounded or squared corners depending on which ones you'd like. And if you do happen to pick anything up through them, there's also the code Auspex for 5% off, so be sure to use that if you pick anything up. They do also have the channel merch dice designs listed there as well, so if you like some Auspex style dice with the black or the white colouring, then check those out too. In any case though, there'll be links down in the video description, and a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. Back to the Space Dwarves though, and next up we have the Memnyr Strategist. He's another really quite fun character model, and he's basically an Ironkin smart boy, so basically already an AI space dwarf, but he's assisted in his big brain thinking with having a whole bunch of other Ironkin brain cores hovering around him, floating around on something called a cognitar mantle, so basically thinking with the power of 5 brains at once, I guess. Again, it looks like one of those answers a rumour engine. Despite not having any great big weapons to threaten people with, people quite enjoys the look and vibe of the model. He's got a nice crafty thinking pose with the hands held together and an augmented set of extra hands taking down some notes in a data slate. I feel like his robes are quite well done as well, and they work quite well for the overall effect. Overall, people seem to have given him a 3.9 out of 5, so I think that's second most enjoyed out of the latest wave of Votann models. Again, maybe hope that his pricing might be on the low end for a support character type model, maybe the $35 to £21 sort of one, though again I really wouldn't be too surprised if it's more. Apparently for his in-game rules, he allows you to gain or spend yield points when you're near objectives, so basically he's going to allow you to double down on the core mechanic for the Leagues of Votann. If it's a good one, then he potentially could be a really interesting model. Obviously hard to say anything too intelligent about yield points, given that we don't really know what the mechanic does. They generally gave the vibe that they're going to be gained by destroying units on objectives and taking objectives, and then potentially spent for damage buffs or maybe durability buffs. Beyond that, they also said that he can also coordinate a free heroic intervention or an overwatch for a unit. I guess that probably would have to be the unit that he's leading, and seems likely that he'd be only able to attach to the Hearthkin warriors, and if so it might not be the biggest deal in the world to be able to do that. If it's just somehow free and army-wide though, that'd certainly be another really quite powerful asset, particularly fire overwatch, which you're almost certainly going to have some good advantage to be able to do. Otherwise though, with the lack of weapons, I suspect it's not going to be much cop in an actual fight. I guess strong incentive to keep him out the way of the action, unless say he maybe needs to be towards a mid-board objective to be able to function properly. Next up, we've got another unit that looks like they could be a mainline damage and defensive unit for the faction, and they're the Ironkin Steeljacks. These models look like they're going to be a set of 3 model elites, and it looks like they've got 3 basic loadout options in the kit. They've got a heavy Vulcanite disintegrator as their main gun, and then 2 melee and pistol loadouts. It looks like it's a Hearthkin bolter in the one hand, and then either a concussion gauntlet or plasma sword in the other. They're an Ironkin warrior unit, when most of the other ones that we've seen so far tend to be engineers or crew or things. So for these ones, they've given them big robotic constructs that can more adequately fulfill their purpose. They're significantly bigger than standard Hearthkin, standing around about twice as tall as them, though it is a little bit odd maybe to see their profile be a little bit closer to standard human as opposed to squat and chunky space dwarves. They're maybe just a bit taller about the legs than I might have guessed for a unit based off the kin. They've got their Ironkin domed brain things, otherwise maybe just going down the Leagues of Votann sort of fairly generic spacesuit warrior aesthetic with a few dwarven hints. One has a crest plus a fun looking scabbard for his plasma sword. For Ironkin warrior elites, which I feel like could have been really quite a well loved unit, people do seem to be a bit more mid on these guys once again. I would say they feel like there's nothing enormously wrong with them, but maybe don't have as many enormous focal points or huge excitement. At least that was my first general impression of them. Seems like they might be falling in a bit middle of the road like the rest of the Votann. When I did some polls about their appearance for recent videos, there was just a lot of miniatures that people didn't really hate but didn't really love either. It doesn't really look like these guys have changed the formula in a big way on that. Price-wise, similar to other 3 model elite box sets, I'd guess they'd probably be £37, $60 or €48 if they came out. Perhaps similar to Brockhir Thunderkin, which look like they're kind of similar sized models. Like several of those kits, I'd imagine they might not be enormously efficient for getting points on the board for the money. There's a few more pictures of them as well. Here's the loadout with the concussion fist on the right, and seems that even the Vulcanite weapon ones have some plasma knives ready for backup. One's got one holstered in a belt behind him. For rules hints for them, I'd be kind of surprised if they weren't in squads of 3 or 6. That seems to be the way with Games Workshop's 3 model elite box sets. In the stream they were described as very durable indeed, and as Wraithguard equivalents. Just looking at the overall size and weight of the models, I'd be surprised if they weren't 3 wounds. Wraithguard are 3 wounds at toughness 6 with a 2+ save, so at least a reasonable chance they could be similar to that. For their melee loadout, we've seen plasma blades versus fists on other units before, likely trading out damage and strength versus numbers of attacks there. At first impressions, I think that the bolters that they're wielding are just standard size Hearthkin ones, but more being used as pistols because the models are bigger. For the ranged loadouts, the heavy Vulcanite disintegrators I suspect will be spammed AP0 damage 2 shots with devastating wounds, kind of similar to Imperial Volkite. I suppose could always be damage 1 shots with devastating wounds, but just more of them though. Finally, we know their revealed special rule, which is the Prey Mark Crest. Critical hits on enemies within range of an objective marker receive precision. If that is their only special rule, then it's not really the best one. Occasionally it might do something, though kind of unreliably, and depends overall if the squad's going to have enough damage threats to seriously have the chance to offer character, I suppose. Hopefully they wind up being overall efficient though. Certainly feel like one of the units to watch to be one of the stronger damage dealers for the faction, I guess weighed up against their other elite infantry rivals. Next up we've got the mole artillery that are the Cthonian Earthshakers. These are an artillery piece that fires a burrowing mole weapon underground, and it looks like these are the answer to not 1 but 2 rumour engines, the sort of handheld controller style one, and the mini drill. It seems that you get 2 miniatures in the kit, and each one's an artillery piece with 3 models crewing it. Plus he also gets the tiny little mole tokens. It looks like it represents them burrowing up from under the ground and casting up a shower of stones before they explode. They're named Chthonian, the same as the Berserks, and they're the bare-muscled guys with the augments. And it seems that the kits have a few aesthetic build options that you can choose to do. You can either have the Ironkin assistant loading a shell directly into it, or have the mortar closed and have him carrying a shell. Plus there's the option for that remote control versus a plasma axe. Overall, these ones got a sort of middling reception on the model liking front. You voted 3.7 out of 5, sort of mid-ranking for the reveal. Price-wise, I suspect that these will be £34 or $58 at first guess. That's based on the Astra Militarum Field Ordnance Battery, which does feel like quite an equivalent kit to me. The models are a throwback to these squat mole mortars. Certainly feels like they've got a similar sort of design there, a sort of tripod with one end being the firing one. So I guess another thing from the old squats reimagined for more current 40k. Here's a few more views of the platform as well, including the ammo case with the mole mortars all ready to go, plus a top-down view of the thing. For rules teasers for it, 2 models in the kit means it'll be a 2-model unit, like the Astra Militarum Field Ordnance batteries. I'd be surprised if you could take any more or any fewer. I suspect it will just be 2 of these and no more, no less. They stated in the stream that they'll be longer ranged than most Leagues of Votann weapons, which isn't too surprising if they're going to be fairly static artillery that's probably not going to be able to move very fast. And given that they can burrow grenades down underground to explode amongst the enemy, they'll be able to indirect fire, so that's probably going to be an overall negative for their rules power in game, given that in 10th edition it's just charged at an enormous premium. They said in the article that they can fire either breacher or tremor shells, so my guess for that is they'll have 2 firing modes, the breacher ones if they actually want to deal some damage to the target, and then perhaps the tremor shells if they want to do a debuff effect. The Chthonian Berserks currently have their mole grenade with the chance to slow down enemy units. I'd guess that the tremor shells here will probably do similar. For the 2 little mole mortar tokens, I'd guess they'd be the thing that are used to confer the status effect, though in the preview they suggested that they might be to represent an expendable counter to fire some really big shells once per game. Will be interesting to see which of those turns out to be right. Maybe seems kind of odd to have the marker actually burrowing up from underground to represent extra ammo though, just maybe wouldn't really fit with the story of the model quite so well. Next up, we've got the new Votann light vehicle in the Kapricus Carrier or Defender. This one's a new entry for the Ironkin. It's a light transport vehicle and fire support vehicle respectively. And the model basically is a jumped up version of the hover trikes that they'd had, this one having 4 hover grav repeller engine type things instead. And it's crewed by the same Ironkin style models with the great big greatcoats, self-reliant Votann scouts and outriders that might be required to operate far from their kin for a long time. It seems that both driver and gunner can both be swapped out for Ironkin though, and the kit is basically a dual build but maybe not having the biggest differences between the 2 in my opinion. The one pictured here is the Kapricus Carrier, and that one has the auto-cannon on top, and then the Defender has a couple of small grenade launchers either side of the pilot, and the gun on top swapped out for a different one. Seems that out of the Votann reveals, this was the one that people were least excited about, people giving it a 3.5 out of 5. Again, not really outright bad by any means, but just a bit less excitement than the rest. I feel like there were maybe kind of similar vibes to when the Ironkin Pioneers got revealed. I'd probably say that the Jaegers just look a bit more balanced as models overall personally. Price-wise, I'd guess it might be somewhere around the Genestealer called Achilles Ridge Runner sort of mark. That's £37 or $60. Seems like it'd fit into the same sort of light vehicle category as that, though of course certainly could be a bit more knowing Games Workshop, with a bit of price creep coming from being a few years more recent. Here's some pictures of the Defender pattern of the vehicle. This one's crewed by 2 Ironkin by the way that they've assembled it. They've got the same twin autocannons on the front, and then grenade launchers mounted to either side of the driver. They do maybe feel just a little bit weirdly stuck on in that position personally. I do quite like the Ironkin gunner though. He's got a great big highlight rotary cannon or a Magna railgun, the latter also having answered another rumour engine. I actually quite like the way that the Ironkin is mounted on a pretty tiny body basically attached to the gun, managed on a little chair to take up less space I guess. From the rules previews they said that it was fast moving. I strongly suspect at least a 12-inch move for this guy. The defensive profile just looks like it's going to be pretty light. I'd say maybe around about 7 to 9 wounds and maybe with a 4+ save due to the exposed crew. Feels like it'd be directly less hard to take down versus the Sagittor. For the carrier variant, they stated it could only transport Ironkin Jaegers, which maybe isn't the best news for it. In a similar way, you'd split the unit in half, so you'd have half in here, and then half either in another one or elsewhere on the board. They don't really strike me as a unit that you'd necessarily want to transport for. the main value being utility as opposed to outright damage and defense. I guess if the points add up and if the vehicle's enough threat just in its own right, you might be able to split the squad in half, have a super cheap and expendable unit as an infiltrating squad, which might be more efficient for that role, and then have this thing rock up as a second wave to cause more disruption and another wave of squads to be expendable and scrap with the enemy. I'm really not sure if that'd be super efficient though, rather than just having them infiltrate as a 10-man. It certainly seems like it wouldn't be a good idea to have a transport for both halves though, if they are going to infiltrate and are paying a premium for that. For the weapons, it's got 2 Memnyr coil autocannons, 2 at the front and then 1 on the turret, so I guess that'd be a fair amount of mid-strength damage to firepower at the moment. For the defender, it still gets a twin Memnyr coil autocannon at the front, then there's 2 grenade launcher style things that are mounted to either side, sort of slanted upwards, so I wonder if they might be indirect fire or something. And then I guess going further on the anti-infantry or an anti-tank role, depending on what you arm the gunner with. I can't help but think that higher strength and damage of a rail cannon is going to outcompete more shots for destroying light infantry personally. Finally, for the new model reveals, last but not least, we've got Buri Aegnirssen. He's a character from a basically wiped out league called the Aegnir block, a league that was wiped out by Tyranids in a move that they said was a callback to the original Squats lore, and kind of fitting to have the story of his model being devoured by Leviathan and then fighting back nonetheless. Apparently he personally has been devoured by multiple Tyranid beasties but still managed to fight his way out of them afterwards, wielding Bane the Darkstar Glaive, and then wanders the galaxy giving assistance to his kin, though usually to help them fight against the Tyranids in one form or another. His miniature is really quite a fun one. He's the most ornate and space dwarf Votann that we've seen maybe so far, wearing a slayed Tyranid as a headdress and cape, a massive great big ornate looking melee weapon, and then a base with some Tyranids theming. He's also heavily bionic as well. Looks like he's got an entirely bionic right hand at least, and has some fingers lost on his other hand at some stage. For this release wave, you guys rated him as your favourite miniature, giving him a 4.1 out of 5 on the star meter. He certainly feels to me like one of the more exciting and centrepiece models that Leagues of Votann have had so far. Nice to see one that's gone down well. I'd guess that if I did my big poll again as to the most enjoyed Votann miniatures, he'd probably be at the top of it. Price-wise, he's likely to be £28, €34 or $45 based on standard Games Workshop Epic Hero pricing. I certainly hope they don't decide to go for more for that. Rules-wise, seems like he certainly could be interesting enough on the tabletop. He's a lone operative Epic Hero, and they basically just talked up his melee a fair bit, though just from looking at him you can tell that it's going to be a pretty nasty close combat threat. Then they mentioned good against monsters. Maybe given his lore he might have some anti-keywords on the go. His special rule is a 2+ chance to revive on death reportedly, and that's really quite a good ability for a lone operative. It'll make him really quite a pain to deal with, and potentially have a good chance to have one last round of damage dealing after he was taken down the first time. I feel like he's going to function kind of similarly to Mephiston or Lucius the Eternal, being a tanky and dangerous lone operative that can wander around the board, though I wouldn't be too surprised if he's not quite as fast as them. Then rules-wise, we got a few tasters of the new Codex. It's 144 pages with 21 datasheets, which unless I'm missing something I think is one extra compared with the new ones that's been added. They've added 7 due to the dual build vehicle, so it seems that one of the models might have a split datasheet, or unless they fancy giving a different specific one for the Hearthkin salvagers as a kill team. Seems there's going to be 5 detachments in the book. No hints as to what they're going to focus on yet, though I feel like a few of them might be guessable. I wouldn't be too surprised if there was a transport one on the cards. And then it seems they've decided to rewrite the core faction mechanic. Rather than having judgment tokens, you're now going to be collecting yield points, where they didn't really fully explain exactly how that's going to work, but it sounds like that you gain yield points for taking objectives and destroying units that held them, and then you spend them in some way to gain bonuses for your army. They mentioned single units getting rerolls, or some sort of army-wide buff to the hit roll, so I guess that means a +1 to hit army-wide could be unlocked in some way. Certainly sounds like it's going to be an impactful mechanic, that may be a bit sad to lose the sort of judgment token grudging style things that the Space Dwarves are well known for. I guess at least for the majority of the army the judgment tokens might be gone, though I wouldn't be too surprised if the faction mechanic lives on in one specific detachment. That does seem to have been the sort of thing they've done with some other armies that have had their main faction mechanic changed. The Eldari kept a version of Strands of Fate, even if it was very different. Otherwise should have all the normal things that codexes have, crusade rules and rules for the new combat patrol amongst them. Speaking of which, finally we got the details for the combat patrol for the Leagues of Votann. This one's likely going to be £100 or $170 and contains the Ironkin Champion, 3 Brockir Thunderkin, 10 Hearthkin Warriors and 5 Ironkin Hearthguard. It feels like a similar sort of balance of units to the previous one, For points in the box, it comes out at around about 390 or so maybe sort of lower middle on that kind of metric compared with the other armies out there, though we don't know exactly what units are going to cost in the Codex, of course. And then on the discount front, it looks like you get around about $224 worth of models in this, and that puts it at around about 24% off, a little bit on the low side for combat patrols, though not unusably so. Overall, both of those numbers come out kind of similar to the old one, really. It did feel like a similar sort of level of generosity and a similar sort of level of usefulness. As combat patrols go, I think it was at least fairly well received. 3.6 stars out of 5 is a bit higher for that compared with plenty of other ones out there in 40k. Feels like the mix of units is alright, having the core troops is nice, plus maybe the most iconic elites and an HQ to lead them. Then an extra damage dealer heavy support unit is never the worst thing to have either. I guess some people might have liked to see some of the new unit choices in there, as plenty of people might already have the ones that are in this one. At least it means that it might release alongside the main release wave, as opposed to having to wait a good long time for it though. Finally, just for one more data point, I thought I'd ask what people actually wanted to buy out of the range. The Leagues of Votann maybe just being a tiny bit niche appeal due to them not being a faction collected by loads at the moment. They're still relatively new to Warhammer 40k. Seems that for actual model sales, the Combat Patrol got the most love, and then the Ironkin Steeljacks, Buri Aegnirssen, the Memnyr Strategist, and the Cthonian Earthshakers. Looks like not quite so many people are going to be rushing out to get the Evaluator Scientist guy and the Kapricus Transport, though of course very early days yet. I feel like finding out what they do in terms of in-game rules often influences people to a greater or lesser extent. Let me know your thoughts on the new wave of Leagues of Votann though. I'd certainly be interested to hear what you think of the new models or any takes on what they might do in-game. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. As mentioned, a big thank you to Baron of Dice for sponsoring this one. There'll be links down in the video description if you'd like to take a look over their stuff. Use the code Auspex if you pick up anything, that gets 5% off. They do have a range of fun designs for a whole bunch of factions out there, including plenty of ones that could be good for the Space Dwarves. I'll leave that one there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Check out the channel's Patreon page if you'd like to support. A massive thank you to anyone doing so. Channel patrons get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case though, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.